we have an issue in certain communities and in certain organizations where there is racism and ethnic chauvinism. So we have to deal with that issue, both from a spiritual perspective and an intellectual perspective.
How do we balance that? How do we capitalize and bring that togetherness and oneness of an ummah? And at the same time, how do we bring that identity all together, bring all these identities together into the group, into the ummah, and make us stronger? Blackness and Islam. Why is this an important book for us today?
No, I'm not worried at all. I rely on God, Allah.
On behalf of the Lifehaqq team, thank you for watching this video. And for more clips and beneficial content, please subscribe to the Lifehaqq channel, your #1 source for personal Islamic development.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. I'd like to welcome all of you back, and we're going to be talking about many important topics of Shaykh Dawud Walid's book, Blackness and Islam. So without further delays, I'd like to welcome Shaykh Dawud Walid. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullahi ta'ala wa barakatuhu wa maghfiratuh.
Shaykh, before we start, I want to share something with you and the audience. I ordered your book, Blackness and Islam. And before I could have it delivered to my house, a brother showed up to me at my house, and he gave me a copy of Blackness and Islam. And he wrote me a message that I just wanted to share with yourself and the audience. He wrote in here, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala inspire us through our history to make history. So this is a message that he wrote for me inside, the front cover of this book. And as you can see, I've made a lot of extensive notes as I went through this book, because I really benefited from this book. And this is just my nature. Anytime I read a book, or if I hear an audio book, I like to make notes so that I can reference different things, inshallah. And so as a result, afterwards it arrived, my book. So this is the one without any notes on it. And this is the one that we're going to give, inshallah, as a gift. So I received as a gift, inshallah, we can give this copy to somebody else as a gift. Blackness and Islam. Why is this an important book for us today? Shaykh, please.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, alhamdulillah, wa sallallahu ala sayyidina wa nabiyyina Muhammadin wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa sallam wa ba'd. Well, I would say that this book has contemporary relevance in a number of different factors. And of course, in the past year, especially since the brutal murders of Breonna Taylor, which it was just a year anniversary yesterday, I believe, of her murder.
Yes.
And then George Floyd, who was brutally lynched in Minnesota last year, that there's been a new awareness talking about Blackness and anti-Black racism in the discourses, not just in America, but in the West in general. And I'd already started writing this book before those murders. But I think the timeliness of it is to inject and have a discussion within the Islamic framework about Blackness and what this has meant historically outside of a secular, so-called woke identity politics context. So I think that's one reason why this book has a level of timeliness to it. The second issue, as it relates to, is that in this book, there are some explicit as well implicit responses to Orientalists and Pan-Africanists who make the claims, the false claim, that Islam from the very beginning, with the time of our beloved Sahaba, may Allah be pleased with them, and in early generations, that Islam is somehow anti-Black or makes Black people be like second-class Muslims within the Ummah. So there are things that are written in this book where I address it explicitly, but more so implicitly, to try to debunk these false tropes and narratives that are put out by people who are adversarial to Islam. Some of them have an agenda, and others of them are just, we could say, jahl basit. They're ignorant, but maybe their intentions aren't malicious. But this type of discourse, when it reaches Black people, especially African Americans and Afro-Caribbeans, that this works against our dawah when they hear this type of discourse. So in effect, this book is to respond to that, to inshallah be a tool for the dawah amongst the African people and Afro-Caribbeans who are not Muslims. Inshallah, they can have some proper information to rebut this, and that they can see themselves in the Islamic narrative. And we pray to Allah Azza wa Jal that every single non-Muslim that reads this book has some stereotypes cleared up, and we ask Allah Azza wa Jal to grant them hidayah so that they can all come to Islam bi'idhnillah ta'ala.
I had a similar conversation, or I had a similar question with Dr. Abdullah Hakim Quick, and I want to pose that to you. How can we, because I feel that we really underutilize our potential and capability as a community, as an ummah, when we focus so much on identities. And how do we balance that? How do we capitalize and bring that togetherness and oneness of an ummah, at the same time recognize a person's identity, so you don't have to necessarily strip yourself of that identity, but how do we bring that identity all together, bring all these identities together into the group, into the ummah, and make us stronger rather than us just carving out territory for ourselves, whether it's like, oh, my group has suffered more than your group, or my group has made more contributions to the ummah than your group. You understand what I'm saying? So how do we bring those identities together in order to enhance our communities?
All right, so we have two extremes, and of course, the best path is the middle path, as the saying goes, خير الأمور أوسطها, that the best of matters is that in the middle. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala made us, وَكَذَلِكَ جَعَلْنَاكُمْ أُمَّةً وَاسِطًا. He made us to take the middle way. So there's one extreme to the left where people get into nationalism, a type of blameworthy nationalism, to the point almost they worship their ethnicity or their race, and it becomes a type of chauvinism where they think they're better and thus people are less civilized or not as good as them. And there's even a nuance of this in the Arabic language where we have the word wathaniya, which means idolatry. And then we have the word wataniya, which means nationalism, or it can be patriotism. So that one harf in the middle is there's a fine line between the tha and the ta, that if we're not careful, we can make nationalism into a false god. We can make it into an idol. So that's the stream on the left. The stream on the right is to play the so-called colorblind game. Allah did not make us colorblind. He made us to see colors, and He said this, that He put this as signs, that He gave us different languages and skin colors, and then He said He made us in different nations and tribes in order that we know one another, li ta'arafu, right? So we're supposed to recognize our diversity and bring us back to oneness and common humanity, but it's not to erase this diversity of culture, and also of how we look in different cultural dresses and things such as that. So, but what happens is when we try to have a completely colorblind Islam, when we say that we're erasing culture, don't worry about culture. What happens is the dominant culture of the organization or the Jama'ah almost every time will make their culture the de facto baseline. So then what happens is those who aren't from the dominant culture of the people who establish the Jama'ah, they say, oh, well, there's no culture in Islam and that's nationalism. What happens is they then try to impose their norms or ways of doing things that aren't clear in the Quran and Sunnah, and try to get people to follow that as the Islamic culture. And that's part of the problem that we have in the Muslim community, and the erasure of Blackness in Islamic history, as well as the ignoring or the ignorance of the great African Muslim empires. And I know you had Shaykh Quick on earlier, Hafidullah Ta'ala. Most Muslims don't know that there was a Khilafah in West Africa, that there was a Mir al-Mu'mineen, right?
Yeah, exactly. People don't know that the Islamic Empire in Spain was supported and actually extended because of Africa. Yeah.
That's right. And also that according to Asadi in Tarikh as-Sudan, that's been translated into English too. It's in Arabic. And also even a non-Muslim historian, Ivan van Sertima, has brought forth the evidence that Muslims who are African actually sailed to the Americas before Columbus got lost coming over here, right? So we have a grand history, and whether you're Black or not, this is part of our civilizational history and our spiritual lineage. So just as we have respect for Uzbekistan and the land of Bukhara and Imam Bukhari, rahimahullah ta'ala, and the Persians and the Mughals, as well as the Arabs, of course, we also need to recognize the importance of Black Africans, Sub-Saharan Africans, and their contributions, starting with the noble Sahaba and going down into the contemporary times.
Jazakallah khair, Sheikh. I think you make a very good point. And, when I'm self-reflective on some of the things you say, I feel that the way you could probably find that balance is if you prioritize your love. If you love Allah first and then His Messenger Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam, afterwards, then I think inherently it gives you that balance in how you approach the love of, say, your tribe or your nation or your ethnicity, right? I think it tempers it, because it's so easy to just fall in love with it or to think that it is the best, thing on the face of the earth. But once you always compare it to the love, okay, how can I love somebody else, from my tribe who doesn't bow to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and I see somebody else from another tribe and he bows to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, if my first priority is Allah? You know what I mean? So I think that's, if we approach it in that way, to always prioritize that love, then we shouldn't have to erase, where we're from or who we are, because in your book you show we have Sahaba who are Black, we have Tabi'een that were Black, we had Ahlul Bayt, like you went through, probably, so many, you couldn't even go through all the figures from Ahlul Bayt that were Black. And so this is, again, as a Muslim, I say they are a part of me and I'm a part of them,
Right.
But you make a very good point, because in modern day, liberal ideology, and you can tell me if you experience this as well, with the whole movement of inclusivity, it's actually caused hegemony of the dominant culture. It's like, okay, no, you should be open to everyone, and everyone should be part of everything, and we should just accept. But that in and of itself is like an ideology. That's in and of itself is a culture, and so sometimes you can lose a person's identity in that, dominant environment. So that I believe that's a very important point that you've made. What do you think is the follow-up to this, Blackness in Islam? What do you think is the next step for our community to, now that we are aware that there is some amazing, people who are Black and Muslim? What is the next step? Because I feel that this is just like the beginning, like in terms of proper healing. Because, obviously, when you look at the way a lot of these, protests and, woke type of activism has gone, you're like, what's your end goal? You have no idea what the end goal is. You know what I mean? But is it revenge? Is it, what is your end goal? But I think Islam gives us a little bit more clarity and guidance. What do you think that looks like from a Islamic perspective?
Well, I think the first thing is the issue of Islah inside of the Muslim community. So the reality is that Islam, Dino Islam, the way of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, is free of racism. But now we have an issue in certain communities and in certain organizations where there is racism and ethnic chauvinism. So we have to deal with that issue, both from a spiritual perspective and an intellectual perspective, right? I can tell you of a story right here of an Islamic school in my state, and there was a young girl whose family's from Senegal, and she was suicidal. And after further review, and we looked into the situation, is because the school that she was going to, that the other girls in her class were picking on her because of her hair, right? And it kept on going on and on and on. And there was some complaints and it wasn't addressed. And she felt suicidal by basically being bullied by Arab girls in her class. So and I've dealt with this personally on more than one occasion where I've had these complaints come to me and have to deal with this in the community, right? So we can clean up our own house. Hopefully, number one, this book can serve as a learning tool where we can start teaching this information starting young. So when we talk about the Sahaba, of course, we have to talk about Ashara Mubashirin. There's no doubt about it. But even how we talk about Ashara Mubashirin, right? We can talk about and look in this book and mention that, yes, Umar ibn al-Khattab, anhu, his great grandmother and his grandmother were both Ethiopians, right? Like, how often is that taught? Or that Umar is described as being very tall and darker than myself in skin color, right? So how often is that talked about? Or the Black Arabs? Or besides the Bilal issue, what about other prominent Sahaba and Sahabiyat like Ayman, anha, who the Prophet ﷺ said, Ayman ummi ba'da ummi. Ayman is the mother after my blood mother. How differently would Black women in the Ummah be treated if we recognize that prophetic reality of what he said? So this is one thing. The second thing is just another issue. And I mentioned this last year when I spoke at the conference. I alluded to it yesterday in the discussion, but it's revisiting how we teach and preach Islam in our community. So Aqidah is important, and that's the foundation of what has to be taught. And getting our fiqh straight, our fiqh ibadat and fiqh mu'amalat regarding our worship and our business transactions, we have to be straight on that. But we also have to focus on tazkiyah and programs of how we talk about spiritual diseases and the remedies to spiritual diseases. And racism fundamentally, unlike what the woke crowd says, can't be legislated away through laws or protesting or court decisions. It is addressing the spiritual diseases that undergird racism, like kibr, like arrogance, like hasid, like envy, right? And then relating from envy, greed, which relates to economic exploitation that's connected to racism. And then we also have the issues of jahl murakab, right? Of compounded ignorance, where people, because of their arrogance, are ignorant and they don't really know other people, but they think they know, and then try to impose their generalizations, biases, and stereotypes. These issues start at the spiritual level, and we need spiritual curriculum. And then we have to give this spiritual medicine to the broader society, right? So, and I'm all for tougher laws on police and holding police accountable, but you can't legislate racism out of a racist heart. A law won't do it. It's a spiritual disease. So we have to reframe things, and we just can't be caught up in this Black Lives Matter style neo-Marxist discourse. It's not going to cut it. It's not going to. It's not the solution.
You know, you make a very powerful point, because some people have just exchanged their clan uniform for a business suit. You know, like, and you see the same effect on people of color, impoverished people, what have you. You see that same effect, that mechanism of supremacy, oppressing and taking advantage, exploiting people. That machinery is still in place. I remember, someone sending me a cartoon saying that, or showing that, there's this plane dropping bombs on Muslims, and the Muslims on their underneath were being bombed, and were saying something to the effect, "Oh, I'm so happy now we're being bombed by people of color, or a mixed or a black vice president." You know what I mean? So again, you can't just say, okay, yeah, this is you can't show that you're racist, but maybe you're still find a way to have the same effect that racism has. You know what I mean?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Just to add Camelback onto what you said. Now in America, the head of the Department of Defense, the Secretary of Defense, is the first African American male ever who will still be involved and help arm dictatorial regimes that will kill Black people who are Muslim, like in Somalia, for instance, right?
Yes.
So it's having someone that looks Black. They still Obama was Black, and he expanded AFRICOM and put in drone bases and was bombing Muslims all through Africa. And his father, he knows what village his father's from in Kenya. So that doesn't mean anything.
Yeah. No, you're absolutely correct. And I think what happens, unfortunately, is a lot of our youth, their energy gets sucked into these things, and you're not really giving the people the right medicine. You know what I mean? It's like saying, hey, take an aspirin to get yourself rid of cancer. That's all you need. That's not the right medicine. Maybe it's going to make you feel good for a few hours, but that's not going to cure you of that disease. And unfortunately, I think that's what they fail to recognize, is that we are not, curing the disease. We're not targeting that disease. And I really appreciated this past week your lecture in the United Islam Awareness Week on Malcolm X, because how wise of a man, how forward thinking he was at his time, that the statements that he made and some of the statements you were sharing that he made during his time, in the 50s and early 60s, that they're just as relevant today. You know what I mean? And they're just as relevant in how we deal with.
Do I feel that the New York police are providing enough protection, or do I have to have protection of my own? I look for protection from Allah.